Nolan Rourke, a struggling single father and former automotive diagnostics engineer, falsely disgraced in a data leak scandal, repairs elderly. Evelyn Whitmore's broken Cadillac for free after discovering its breakdown was caused by deliberate sabotage rather than wear. When Evelyn's daughter, Whitmore Motors CEO Cassandra Whitmore, investigates, Nolan uncovers the same hidden fault pattern inside the company's flagship Aurora X autonomous vehicle project. His findings reveal that board chairman Bennett Ashcroft and general counsel Graham Hollis orchestrated a scheme to sabotage the vehicles. Endanger, Evelyn manipulates stock prices and seized control of the company, while Hollis was also linked to the conspiracy that destroyed Nolan's career years earlier. Despite being ridiculed, framed again, and nearly losing his garage, Nolan gathers irrefutable evidence through technical analysis, recovered access logs, dashboard footage, and independent audits. Cassandra invokes a forgotten company charter, exposes the conspiracy before the board, removes Ashcroft and Hollis, halts the dangerous vehicle launch, and clears Nolan's name. Rather than joining Whitmore Motors as an executive, Nolan keeps his independent garage, which becomes an official Whitmore safety inspection partner, restoring his reputation while allowing him to continue serving ordinary people with honesty and integrity. Nolan Rourke only meant to patch a loose wire under the hood of an old woman's Cadillac before the sky opened up completely, and then he meant to drive home before dark to a garage that barely kept its lights on. He didn't take a dime for it, even though there were only a few crumpled bills left in his pocket for dinner that night. But as the old woman pulled away down the wet road, Nolan noticed something strange beneath the hood that had nothing to do with age or rust. A clean, deliberate cut that looked less like failure and more like sabotage. The kind of damage made by someone who wanted a car to die in a very specific place. That night, his phone rang in the empty garage. The voice on the other end belonged to Cassandra Whitmore, the coldest chief executive in Detroit, and the first sentence she said made Nolan's chest go tight with a fear he hadn't felt in years. If you enjoy stories about quiet people who turn out to carry more weight than anyone expected, subscribe on the channel so you never miss the next one. The garage sat on the ragged edge of Detroit past the last strip mall and just before the road turned to gravel. Its tin roof patched in 3 places and its sign so faded that most people driving by could no longer read the name painted across it decades earlier. Nolan Rourke had kept it alive through sheer stubbornness because the newer chain shops downtown had glass waiting rooms and coffee machines and technicians in matching polo shirts, while he had a rolling toolbox, a space heater that only worked on the third try, and hands that understood an engine the way most people understood their own heartbeat. He worked from before sunrise until well after dark most days, and customers who did find their way to him always left saying the same thing, that the man could diagnose a problem just by listening to it idle for 10 seconds. But listening to an engine and paying rent were 2 very different skills, and lately Nolan had far more of the first than the second. He had not always smelled like motor oil and lived paycheck to paycheck. Years earlier, he had been a diagnostics engineer at a respected automotive technology firm, the kind of job that came with a parking spot and a title on the door, until a data leak scandal rocked the company, and someone needed a name to attach to the blame. Nolan's name got chosen quietly and efficiently by people who understood exactly how much louder an accusation is than a denial. He lost the job, the reputation, and most of the friendships that had depended on both, and he rebuilt his life. One wrench turn at a time in a town where nobody asked about his past because nobody cared enough to look. His daughter stayed most weeks with her aunt across town while Nolan worked long hours trying to keep the lights on. A quiet ache he carried without ever complaining about it out loud, because complaining had never once fixed a bill. Nolan still remembered the exact week his old life ended, the way a person remembers the last ordinary morning before everything changes. The coffee that went cold on his desk while investigators walked through the office with clipboards and carefully neutral faces. Nobody had shouted at him. Nobody had even raised their voice, and somehow that had been worse than any argument because quiet accusations left no room to fight back against anything specific. He had spent the following year applying to firms that wouldn't return his calls once his old employer's name appeared on his resume, until eventually he stopped applying altogether and let the smell of brake fluid replace the smell of an office building he no longer missed as much as he expected to. On the morning this story truly begins, an envelope arrived taped to the garage door instead of slipped through the mail slot, which was never a good sign. It was from the landlord, informing Nolan that the property was being considered for sale to a commercial developer, eager to flatten the block and build something with more parking and less history. If the overdue rent wasn't settled within 2 weeks, the garage would be handed over regardless of what Nolan wanted. He read the letter twice, folded it along its existing creases, and went back to the truck he'd been rebuilding an alternator for because there was nothing else useful to do with anger, except point it at a job that needed finishing. Nolan had a simple rule that had never once made him rich. If a car could get someone home safely, he fixed it first and worried about payment later. That rule was about to collide with something far bigger than he could have imagined. The rain started around 4:00 in the afternoon, thin at first, and then heavy enough to blur his windshield wipers into uselessness. And it was in that gray wash of water that Nolan spotted a pale blue Cadillac Fleetwood pulled crookedly onto the shoulder of the county road. An elderly woman stood beside it in a raincoat too thin for the weather, her phone apparently dead waving without much hope at the cars sliding past her without slowing. Several sedans and one very expensive black coupe passed within feet of her without even tapping their brakes. And Nolan felt something in his stomach twist the way it always did when he saw people treated like scenery. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder ahead of her and stepped out into the downpour without a second thought about the tow money he wasn't going to charge her. The woman introduced herself as Evelyn Whitmore, and she apologized for the trouble with the kind of old-fashioned politeness that made Nolan instantly like her, joking that the car was about as old and stubborn as its owner. Nolan smiled, told her it happened to the best of engines, and popped the hood to take a look while she stood beneath the meager shelter of her open door. What he found in the next few minutes erased the smile from his face entirely. A sensor wire had been sliced clean through in a spot no wear pattern would ever reach naturally. A fuse had been swapped for one of the wrong rating entirely, and a connector beneath the intake manifold showed fresh scratch marks from being pulled loose and jammed back into place in a hurry. This was not decay. This was design. He didn't want to frighten an elderly woman standing alone on a dark roadside, so Nolan kept his voice calm and practical as he rigged a temporary fix using tools from his own truck, enough to get the Cadillac running smoothly again for the drive home. Evelyn thanked him with more warmth than the moment probably called for, and when she tried to press a small envelope of cash into his hand, he gently closed her fingers back around it and told her to save it, only asking that she have someone she trusted look the car over properly before driving it any real distance again. She studied his face for a long moment in the glow of her headlights, the way people study something they suspect they will need to remember later, and asked for the name of his shop. Nolan dug out an old business card with curling edges and handed it over, feeling faintly embarrassed by how worn it looked in her manicured fingers. Before she drove off, Nolan caught a glimpse of a leather folder resting on the back seat of the Cadillac embossed with a corporate emblem reading Whitmore Motors. But he didn't think much of it at the time, assuming it belonged to a relative or a driver. He simply closed the folder of his own curiosity the way he always did with things that weren't his business, climbed back into his soaked truck and drove the rest of the way home, turning the strange wiring damage over and over in his mind like a puzzle piece that didn't belong to the picture in front of him. Back at the garage, Nolan couldn't shake the image of that clean surgical cut in the sensor wire. So instead of eating the cold sandwich waiting for him on the workbench, he pulled out an old technical notebook from his engineering days and began sketching the fault by memory, marking exactly where each altered component sat relative to the wiring harness. The pattern that emerged troubled him more the longer he stared at it, because this kind of failure was engineered to let a vehicle run fine for a stretch of road before dying in an unpredictable, potentially dangerous location. It wasn't random vandalism. It was the work of someone who understood automotive systems at a level most amateur mechanics never reached. Close to midnight, the garage phone rang its old bell, startling him out of his notes. The voice on the other end was sharp-clipped and entirely unfamiliar, and the woman introduced herself as Cassandra Whitmore, chief executive of Whitmore Motors, and as it turned out, Evelyn's daughter. There was no thank you in her opening words, only an accusation dressed up as a question, demanding to know exactly what Nolan had done to her mother's car and why a stranger had been alone with it on the side of a dark road. Cassandra had spent years fending off people who used her mother as a way to get close to money or influence, and Nolan's kindness registered to her at first as nothing more than a new angle on an old con. Nolan answered evenly, explaining that he hadn't taken a single dollar and hadn't known who Evelyn was until this very phone call. He described without embellishment exactly what he'd found beneath the hood: The severed sensor wire, the mismatched fuse, the scratched connector that had clearly been removed and reinstalled by someone in a hurry. On the other end of the line, Cassandra went quiet in a way that told Nolan he had just described something no one had reported to her. Something that didn't match whatever explanation her own security team had already given her about the incident. Her voice, when it returned, had lost its edge and gained something closer to alarm. "Mr. Rourke," she said, her tone dropping low enough that Nolan had to press the phone closer to his ear. "If what you're telling me is true, then someone inside my own company just tried to kill my mother." The line went silent after that, both of them absorbing the weight of a sentence that had just turned a roadside breakdown into something far more dangerous than either of them had expected only hours earlier. By 9:20 the next morning, an unfamiliar luxury sedan rolled to a stop outside Nolan's garage, flanked by a second vehicle carrying 2 security men and a young attorney clutching a leather portfolio like it might run away from her. Cassandra Whitmore stepped out first, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the oil-stained concrete and the rusted lift in the center of the bay. Nolan was elbow-deep in a pickup's engine bay when she walked in, and the contrast between them, her polished authority and his grease-stained forearms, was not lost on anyone in the room, least of all the attorney who wrinkled her nose at the smell of the shop. Cassandra still hadn't shed her suspicion entirely, and she got straight to business, sliding a printed agreement across Nolan's workbench that offered him $10,000 in exchange for his silence about the condition of her mother's car. Nolan read it once, set it down without picking up the pen offered to him, and told her plainly that if her mother's life had genuinely been in danger, silence was the last thing anyone should be paying for. The young attorney let out a short, disbelieving laugh and asked with more sarcasm than professionalism whether a roadside mechanic was now going to lecture a fortune-level executive on crisis management. Nolan didn't rise to the insult. Instead, he reached beneath his workbench and produced the severed length of wire he'd replaced the night before, along with the mismatched fuse, laying them both on the bench between himself and Cassandra, like evidence at a trial neither of them had asked to attend. He pointed out the precision of the cut made with a bladed tool rather than accidental friction, and the strange discoloration on the connector that didn't match ordinary corrosion patterns at all. Something in Cassandra's carefully composed expression cracked slightly as she leaned closer to examine what he was showing her. He went further, telling her that this kind of damage wasn't designed simply to strand a car on the roadside, but to generate a very specific kind of failure report. One that would lead any inspector to assume old age and neglect rather than intent. Cassandra's jaw tightened as she absorbed this, and after a long pause she admitted something she clearly hadn't intended to share with a stranger in a roadside garage. Whitmore Motors was weeks away from launching its flagship autonomous vehicle line. The Aurora X series and several prototype units in closed testing had recently begun experiencing failures that engineers had labeled vaguely and unconvincingly as unexplained. That afternoon, against the objections of nearly everyone around her, Cassandra brought Nolan to the Whitmore Motors technical campus, though she was careful not to introduce him as any kind of consultant. To the engineers and mid-level managers who glanced his way, she simply called him the man who worked on my mother's car. A description that did nothing to soften the judgmental looks aimed at his scuffed boots and lack of a company badge. Several younger staff members exchanged glances that made their opinion of him obvious without a single word being spoken. Nolan was handed a tablet loaded with failure logs from the prototype fleet, and it took him only minutes to recognize the same fingerprint he'd found under Evelyn's hood. Sensor data was drifting by tiny, almost imperceptible margins, and the vehicle's own self-diagnostic system kept blaming wear and environmental exposure instead of flagging anything intentional. But beneath that surface explanation, someone had clearly built a sequence of faults designed to trigger at a precise, predetermined moment, not through decay, but through calculation. It was at that point that Bennett Ashcroft entered the room, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees the instant he did. As chairman of the Whitmore Motors board, Ashcroft carried himself with the practiced calm of a man who had never once been told no and meant to keep it that way. His voice smooth and unbothered as he asked Cassandra in front of the entire engineering team why exactly a roadside mechanic had been granted access to confidential testing data. The question wasn't really a question. It was a public correction dressed in polite words, and everyone in the room understood it as such. Nolan was asked to leave the room while the adults discussed matters above his supposed pay grade, and as he gathered his things to go, his eyes caught a diagnostic chart still glowing on one of the wall monitors. Something about the error code sequence struck him as familiar in a way that made his stomach drop an echo of the exact fault architecture from the very project that had ended his engineering career years earlier, under circumstances he had never been able to fully prove were manufactured against him. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was close enough to be the same signature buried inside a company he'd never worked for directly, at least not on paper. Later that evening, unable to let the connection go, Cassandra had her assistant quietly pull whatever public records existed on Nolan Rourke, and what surfaced painted a very different picture than the tired mechanic she'd first dismissed. Years earlier, Nolan had been a rising engineer at a firm called Hollis Adaptive Systems, a company that had once licensed diagnostic software to several major automakers before quietly dissolving under a cloud of allegations. Nolan had been accused of leaking proprietary data, but the internal case file, when Cassandra finally got someone to dig it up, was riddled with inconsistencies that read less like an investigation and more like a story written in advance. When Cassandra confronted him gently about it the following day, Nolan finally let the full story spill out quiet and unhurried the way people tell truths they've kept locked away for a long time. I explained that he had discovered a hidden back door in the diagnostic software at Hollis Adaptive Systems, one that allowed someone with the right access to remotely alter failure reports after the fact. Before he could report it through proper channels, the incriminating data vanished entirely, and his own digital signature was mysteriously attached to an unauthorized access log that he had never created. Cassandra's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something closer to dread when she recognized a name buried in the old case file. Graham Hollis, now serving as general counsel for Whitmore Motors, had once been a senior partner at the very company that destroyed Nolan's career. The realization hit her like a physical blow because it meant someone with deep knowledge of exactly how to manipulate diagnostic systems now sat inside her own boardroom with unrestricted access to everything. For the first time since this ordeal began, Cassandra allowed herself to consider that the danger wasn't outside her company at all, but comfortably seated within it. Nolan spoke plainly about what that old betrayal had cost him, describing how a man in his position was rarely believed until the very people who dismissed him needed saving. He said he had no interest in returning to a world of boardrooms and expensive suits, a world that had once decided he was disposable the moment it became convenient. Cassandra, likely for the first time in years, lowered her guard enough to apologize quietly, acknowledging that she had judged him by his clothing before she had judged him by his evidence, and that the mistake embarrassed her more than she wanted to admit. Despite her private doubts, Cassandra arranged for Nolan to present his findings before a closed session of the board, hoping the data itself would speak louder than his appearance ever could. Ashcroft agreed to the meeting far too readily, and Cassandra should have recognized that eagerness as a warning rather than a concession. In truth, Ashcroft intended to use the session to humiliate Nolan, publicly believing it would fracture Cassandra's authority and hand him the leverage he'd been quietly building for months. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, several members exchanged smirks the moment Nolan walked in carrying a battered toolbox instead of a laptop bag, an image that told them everything they assumed they needed to know about his credibility. Ashcroft opened with a pointed remark about discussing billion-dollar technology rather than oil changes, drawing a ripple of quiet laughter from around the table that he clearly relished. Nolan didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, and didn't bother defending his appearance because he had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something other people's opinions could actually take from him. He asked simply for the raw diagnostic logs from 3 prototype vehicles to be displayed alongside the fault history pulled from Evelyn's Cadillac, a request that drew audible scoffs from several board members who couldn't imagine what an aging luxury sedan had to do with cutting-edge autonomous tech. Nolan waited patiently as the technical staff somewhat reluctantly pulled up both datasets on the room's central display, the numbers streaming in parallel columns that meant nothing to most of the people watching them. Then he pointed to a single overlapping thread running through both sets of data, a shared subroutine signature matching signal delay, and identical patterns of data being scrubbed clean immediately after each failure occurred. One board member, a heavy-set man who had barely looked up from his phone since the meeting began, finally set it down and asked with genuine confusion rather than hostility how a used car worth barely a few $1,000s could possibly share anything meaningful with a fleet of prototypes worth a fortune in research alone. Nolan answered him directly without condescension, explaining that fraud rarely bothers reinventing itself when an old trick still works perfectly well, and that whoever built this fault sequence had simply recycled a tool they trusted rather than risk something so untested on a launch this important. A few heads around the table tilted slightly, the first sign that skepticism was beginning to soften into something closer to genuine attention. Graham Hollis attempted to interrupt, insisting Nolan was reaching for connections that simply weren't there, his tone carrying the practiced condescension of a man used to talking his way past uncomfortable questions. Nolan calmly replied that whoever had tampered with Evelyn's vehicle had made one critical mistake, using the exact same fault simulation framework embedded within the Aurora X testing software, a framework that had almost certainly never been meant to surface outside a closed lab environment. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Cassandra, watching the room's mood shift from mockery to unease, made an immediate call to lock down every system credential tied to the prototype testing environment before anyone could quietly erase what Nolan had just exposed. Ashcroft's eyes flicked toward Graham for a fraction of a second, a small involuntary tell that Nolan didn't miss. And in that instant he understood with complete certainty that both men were far more afraid of the truth than they were willing to show. That evening Evelyn called Nolan again, her voice warm but tinged with something new, a worried edge that hadn't been there during their roadside encounter. She told him that after replaying the events in her mind, she remembered a member of her household security detail suggesting almost casually that she take an unfamiliar back road home because the usual route was supposedly congested that day. It hadn't struck her as suspicious in the moment, but now knowing what she knew, it felt less like a suggestion and more like a setup. Nolan asked if the Cadillac had any kind of dashboard camera installed, and Evelyn confirmed that her late husband, ever the cautious man, had insisted on mounting 1 year earlier despite the vehicle's age. Cassandra had the footage retrieved within the hour, and what it showed sent a fresh wave of urgency through the entire investigation. A technician in a contractor's uniform could clearly be seen approaching the Cadillac in a private parking area, working beneath the hood for several unhurried minutes before walking away as though he had every right to be there. Nolan recognized the contractor's logo stitched onto the uniform immediately, tracing it back to a subcontracting firm that had once operated within the same network as Hollis Adaptive Systems years earlier. It was in Nolan's mind no longer a coincidence but a confirmed thread connecting an old betrayal to a brand new conspiracy. In a moment that hit Cassandra especially hard, Evelyn revealed something about her late husband, the original founder of Whitmore Motors, that neither Nolan nor most of the current board had ever known existed. Evelyn explained that her husband had never fully trusted Bennett Ashcroft, even decades earlier when the two men first built the company together, and had quietly written a special provision into the company's founding charter as a safeguard. If credible evidence ever surfaced showing the board chairman had endangered the founding family or knowingly compromised product safety, the sitting chief executive would have the authority to trigger an emergency audit and immediately suspend the chairman's voting power. It was an old, nearly forgotten clause buried deep in decades of amended bylaws, and it was exactly the weapon Cassandra needed to fight back. Ashcroft and Graham struck first, leaking a distorted version of Nolan's past to a local business reporter, framing him as a disgraced engineer, manipulating a vulnerable, guilt-ridden executive to settle an old score against the industry that had once cast him out. Within a day, reporters had gathered outside Nolan's garage, and his landlord, sensing an opportunity, suddenly demanded immediate repossession of the property rather than waiting out the original 2-week deadline. Nolan found himself trapped in a painfully familiar position, watching people with money and influence rewrite his story faster than he could correct it. Cassandra offered to bury him in company lawyers for protection, but Nolan refused to let her turn him into a charity case wrapped in expensive representation. All he asked for was a copy of the untouched original server data and roughly 1 full day to prove beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what had happened. He reached out to an old friend named Rowan Pierce, who now worked as an independent vehicle safety auditor. And though Rowan hesitated at first, worried about the risk to his own career, the possibility that this flaw could endanger thousands of everyday drivers was enough to convince him to help. As Nolan dug deeper into the compromised code, he discovered something that turned his concern into something close to alarm. A hidden trigger scheduled to activate the exact same day the Aurora X line was set to launch publicly. If left unchecked, a very public and very catastrophic failure would unfold in front of cameras and customers alike, sending Whitmore Motors stock into freefall, forcing Cassandra out of her position and allowing Ashcroft's allies to buy up the wounded company at a fraction of its true worth. Nolan spent that night before the launch, working straight through the darkness inside his own garage without the sleek laboratory equipment a company like Whitmore could easily provide, relying instead on an aging laptop salvaged circuit boards pulled from scrapped vehicles and years of hard-won instinct. Cassandra arrived alone this time without her usual security escort and found Nolan exactly as he truly was, poor in circumstance but precise in every movement, worn around the edges yet nowhere near incompetent. Watching him work in his natural environment told her more about the man than any boardroom presentation ever could have. He walked her through the plan, carefully explaining that simply accusing someone of sabotage would never be enough, that the malicious code itself needed to expose its own existence in front of the board and any outside auditors who might otherwise dismiss the accusation as speculation. Using the data pulled from Evelyn's Cadillac, Nolan built a simulation designed to merge with the Aurora X testing data and force the system to reconstruct the deleted failure logs hidden somewhere beneath layers of overwritten code. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind that rewarded patience far more than panic. And more than once, Cassandra caught herself holding her breath as a line of code refused to cooperate before finally yielding to whatever quiet trick Nolan tried next. She asked him at one point how he managed to stay so calm while everything he'd rebuilt over the last several years. His shop, his name, his fragile peace hung on the outcome of a single overnight gamble. Nolan told her that panic had never once fixed a broken system in his experience. Only steady hands and the willingness to keep trying long after most people would have given up and gone home. Somewhere around 300 in the morning, the old space heater in the corner finally gave out entirely, and Cassandra found herself wrapped in a spare mechanic's jacket that smelled faintly of engine grease, laughing quietly at how far removed this was from any board meeting she'd ever attended. Nolan barely looked up from the screen, muttering that this was usually the part where clients started questioning whether they'd hired the right person, and Cassandra admitted, somewhat surprised by her own honesty, that she had never felt more confident in anyone's hands in her life. It was a strange, unplanned kind of trust to build at 300 in the morning over a broken laptop and a pot of burnt coffee, but it held steady exactly when both of them needed it too. Midway through the night, Cassandra received a call from Ashcroft demanding she abandon the investigation, entirely warning her that the board would vote her out as chief executive by morning if she refused to comply with his terms. For one brief human moment, Cassandra visibly wavered, torn between protecting the company her father had built with his own hands and doing what she now understood deep down to be the only right choice. Nolan looked up from his work just long enough to remind her quietly but firmly that saving her chair while letting a defective vehicle onto public roads wouldn't preserve her father's legacy at all. It would only make her the person who signed off on the next tragedy. Just before sunrise, the recovered access logs finally resolved on the screen in front of them, and neither Nolan nor Cassandra spoke for several seconds as they absorbed what the data was telling them. The authorization credential responsible for altering the testing environment didn't belong to any junior technician at all, but traced directly back to Graham Hollis's legal office, and it carried a secondary approval signature stamped with Bennett Ashcroft's own executive authorization code. There was no more room for doubt. Only the cold clarity of proof finally catching up to instinct. The next morning, Ashcroft convened an emergency board session with a single stated purpose to remove Cassandra from her position for allegedly exposing confidential company data to an outsider with a documented history of dishonesty. Most of the assembled board members appeared visibly aligned with Ashcroft before the meeting even began. Their expressions already settled into the practiced neutrality of people who had made up their minds days earlier. Nolan was summoned into the room as what Ashcroft clearly intended to be a hostile witness meant to seal Cassandra's fate. Ashcroft wasted no time turning his attention toward Nolan, reminding the room in cutting detail that this was a man who had once lost his career over allegations of data theft, now apparently attaching himself to a wealthy young executive for reasons that were, in his words, painfully obvious to anyone paying attention. Several board members studied Nolan with the same dismissive expression he'd grown used to over the years. The look of people who had already decided he didn't belong in a room like this one regardless of what he might have to say. Cassandra, remaining composed despite the mounting pressure, invoked the emergency provision her father had written into the company charter decades earlier, catching Graham completely off guard as he scrambled to object on procedural grounds. Before he could finish his protest, the boardroom doors opened and Evelyn Whitmore walked in. No longer the fragile-looking woman stranded on a rainy roadside, but a founding shareholder with a documented legal standing to formally certify the very provision now being invoked against the chairman. Nolan calmly pulled up his simulation on the main display, running the exact conditions Evelyn's Cadillac had experienced through the reconstructed Aurora X testing environment for everyone in the room to witness firsthand. The malicious code, exactly as he predicted, attempted to mask its own failure automatically, only to leave behind the digital fingerprint it couldn't fully erase under pressure. Rowan Pierce, present as an independent auditor, confirmed on record that this data lived on internal servers well before Nolan had ever set foot inside the company, making any accusation of fabrication on his part entirely impossible. He added, for the benefit of the board members still clinging to doubt, that a technician with Nolan's history could have simply disappeared into private consulting work years ago and made a comfortable living quietly rather than risk his name again on a fight this public and this thankless. Then came the moment that silenced the entire room completely. Cassandra displayed Evelyn's dashboard footage, the access logs bearing Graham's digital signature, and the executive authorization trail leading directly back to Ashcroft's own credentials, laying out a chain of evidence too precise to argue against. The trial that Ashcroft had engineered to end Cassandra's career had, in the span of a single morning, turned itself completely around, and it was his own conduct now on trial in front of the very board he'd spent years quietly manipulating. The full scope of Ashcroft's scheme unraveled quickly once investigators started pulling threads. He had orchestrated a deliberate safety flaw inside the Aurora X line timed to detonate publicly right as the vehicle launched, hoping to crater the company's stock price long enough for allied investors to swoop in, remove Cassandra from leadership, and seize control of the valuable self-driving patents underlying the entire project. Evelyn's Cadillac had never been the real target. Merely a low-risk test run meant to frighten her away from an upcoming shareholder meeting where her vote could have tipped decisive support toward Cassandra's leadership. Nobody anticipated that a broke mechanic offering free roadside help would unravel a scheme built on carefully hidden signatures and outsourced sabotage. Graham tried briefly and unconvincingly to shift blame onto the outside contractor, but Cassandra's recovery team produced encrypted payment transfers and internal correspondence that told a far more damning story. Ashcroft lost his voting authority within the hour, facing both civil and criminal investigations soon after, while Graham was suspended from his position before he even finished packing up his briefcase. Nolan didn't celebrate any of it. His only concern, once the confessions and consequences began piling up, was making certain every prototype vehicle carrying the tampered code got pulled from testing before anyone outside that boardroom got hurt. It was, in its own quiet way, the clearest window into who Nolan truly was. A man who hadn't fought this battle for money or vindication, but because he understood far too personally what it felt like when a manufactured lie destroyed something real. And he refused to let another lie cost someone their life. In the days that followed the crisis, Cassandra offered Nolan a senior position within Whitmore Motors, Director of Independent Diagnostic Safety, complete with veto authority over any technical report touching vehicle safety. The salary attached would have easily cleared his debts and secured his garage outright. Yet Nolan didn't accept right away, hesitant about stepping back into a world that had once ground him down without hesitation or apology. Cassandra didn't pressure him, telling him instead that this time he wouldn't be begging for a place inside the company. The company simply needed him if it ever hoped to operate with a clean conscience again. Evelyn arrived at the garage not long after with a freshly painted sign under her arm reading, "Rourke Independent Motors, Certified Safety Partner of Whitmore Motors." A gesture that solved the dilemma neither Cassandra nor Nolan had quite figured out how to voice. Rather than absorbing him into a massive corporate structure that might dull everything sharp and honest about him, Cassandra instead signed a formal partnership, making his small shop an official independent inspection site for the company. It was a quietly perfect ending, one where Nolan kept his garage, kept his independence, and watched people who had once looked down on him now send their most expensive vehicles directly to his door for inspection. Months later, the Aurora X line finally launched later than originally scheduled, but far safer and more transparent for the delay. Cassandra spoke openly in interviews about a mechanic who had seen the truth clearly while an entire boardroom remained fixated on profit margins and quarterly projections, careful never to shrink his contribution down to a feel-good footnote in the company's official story. Nolan never grew comfortable with attention, and he returned to his ordinary routine soon enough, fixing everyday cars for everyday people who needed their engines running by morning. On the wall of his garage now hung a simple framed letter, a formal apology from Whitmore Motors, acknowledging the wrongful accusations that had once ended his engineering career alongside his new certification as an independent safety partner. Every so often, Evelyn still drove out in her old Cadillac, not because anything was wrong with it, but simply to bring Nolan a cup of coffee and sit for a while in the folding chair by the workbench. Cassandra visited too on occasion, no longer carrying suspicion in her posture, but something closer to quiet gratitude toward a man who had once given her the truth for free exactly when she needed it most. She never stopped teasing him about the space heater that had died at 3:00 in the morning, and Nolan finally replaced it, though he kept the broken one propped in a corner of the garage as a strange sentimental reminder of the night. Everything changed. Word traveled slowly through the small community around his garage, the way word always does in places where everyone eventually hears everything, and old customers who once brought their business elsewhere because his shop looked too tired and too small began quietly returning some without ever mentioning why. Nolan never brought up the boardroom, never mentioned Ashcroft's name if he could help it, and never once let the story change the way he greeted a customer walking through his door with a sputtering engine and an empty wallet. He still fixed the cars of people who couldn't pay right away because some habits once built out of necessity simply became part of who a person was, regardless of circumstance. His daughter noticed the difference before anyone explained it to her, remarking one evening that her father seemed to stand a little straighter than she remembered, though she couldn't quite say why. Nolan told her only that sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything for a while. And then if you're patient and a little bit stubborn, it eventually gives some of it back with interest. She didn't fully understand what he meant that night, but she filed it away the way children do with the things their parents say quietly and mean completely. Nolan had believed on that rainy afternoon that he was simply fixing one stranger's car for nothing more than common decency. He never expected that a single small act of kindness would become the wrench that finally cracked open a much larger, much more corroded machine, one built quietly out of greed, false signatures, and years of unchecked power, and that fixing it would finally give him back the one thing money alone had never been able to buy him: his name.